So we're going to take a journey back in time, back to the 1870s, to the gritty, crowded, and honestly pretty filthy streets of New York City. But we're not going to be looking at the Gilded Age mansions or the famous tycoons. No, we're going to the very bottom. We're diving into the world of homeless children, all seen through the eyes of one man, Charles Loring Brace, and his really incredible book, The Dangerous Classes of New York.
My eyes, what soft beds these! Okay, I want you to hear that voice first. It's the absolutely joyful shout of a little New York newsboy. And it sounds, well, it sounds pretty nice, doesn't it? Like he's found some incredible luxury. But here's the thing, the context is everything. He wasn't sinking into a feather bed. He was reacting to a simple, clean cot in a charity lodging house. For him, that was luxury. He said it was "rather better and bummin'," that's sleeping on the streets, and most as good as a steam gratin, without a cop poking you with a club to wake you up. That one sentence, it tells you everything you need to know about the world we're about to step into.
You see, that little boy was part of what Charles Loring Brace called the dangerous classes. Now, what's so fascinating about that term is that it wasn't just about being poor. Not at all. It was about fear. In the mind of the 19th century public, this huge, unsupervised population of kids wasn't just a tragedy. It was a ticking time bomb. They were seen as this future army of criminals, a whole generation growing up without morals, without religion, without any rules, who would one day just rise up and tear society apart.
And we're not talking about a small number here. We are talking about tens of thousands of children. Just let that number sink in for a second. They were packed into infamous neighborhoods like the Five Points. And these kids, well, they were born into a world that didn't see them as victims. It saw them as future criminals. The Five Points wasn't just a poor neighborhood. It was a symbol for everything wrong with the city, a place where life was unbelievably cheap and just surviving the day was a brutal fight. For these kids, a real childhood, it just didn't exist.
Okay, so let's go deeper. What did it actually feel like to be one of these kids? Brace called them street Arabs, which was the slang at the time. Well, it meant you had to work. You had to hustle. You had to basically build a life for yourself out of the city's garbage. And you developed this really tough exterior way too young, an attitude that was, frankly, both heartbreaking and pretty terrifying to the adults who saw them.
And these kids, they were like little entrepreneurs of survival, each with their own trade. You had the newsboy, who had to be loud and quick and ready to fight for a good street corner. You had the bootblack, who had to be incredibly persistent, putting up with insults and terrible weather for just a few pennies. You had rag pickers and timber merchants, which is a pretty fancy name for a kid selling matches, who would literally dig through filth to find anything valuable. And then you had the pickpocket, the most skilled and the most feared. And you have to understand, for a starving kid, the line between selling a paper and lifting a wallet was razor thin. It was a line they crossed every single day just to eat.
And that brings us to the language of the street itself. If you couldn't scrape together 5 cents for a bed in one of those lodging houses, you were a bummer, or a snoozer, and that meant you slept wherever you could find a little bit of shelter or warmth, in a big discarded packing box, a shadowy doorway, or, the best spot, huddled over a steam grate. This wasn't just slang. It was an identity. It defined a life lived completely outside of everything we consider normal. No home, no family, no school. You were basically invisible to the rest of the world, except, of course, when they saw you as a threat.
So, the big question is, where did all these kids come from? I mean, they didn't just appear on the streets. Brace had a theory. He argued that they were the direct product of a toxic environment, an environment born in the filth of the tenement houses and then forged into something harder in the gangs on the street.
Brace's writing, it's like a punch to the gut. He paints this picture of the tenements that is just, it's almost medieval, it's so horrible. I mean, can you imagine living somewhere where the air literally smells like rotting meat, where the yard is just a pile of bones and disgusting rags, where diseases like cholera are just part of the neighborhood? This was home for thousands of families. It was a place of sickness, alcoholism, and constant violence. The conditions were so bad, they seemed designed to just break people and drive the kids out onto the streets where, believe it or not, they actually felt more free.
And that is exactly where the gangs came from. It makes perfect sense, right? When your home is a living hell and society has completely turned its back on you, who do you turn to? Each other. Gangs like the 19th Street Gang weren't just about being criminals. They were like substitute families. They had their own rules, their own territory, their own leaders. In a world where everyone was a predator, the gang offered protection. When you had nothing, the gang gave you an identity.
It was a brutal, but brutally effective way to survive. So after painting this absolutely horrifying picture of the problem, Brace then offered a solution. And it was radical, it was ambitious, and it turned out to be deeply controversial. He called it the Children's Aid Society, and he started it in 1853 to basically wage war on the conditions that created these street Arabs. So his society had this three-part plan. First, industrial schools. These offered the absolute basics, a warm meal, a little reading and writing, and some job skills, like sewing, so a kid could maybe get a real job. Second, the lodging houses, which offered a safe, clean place to sleep for just a few pennies. But it's the third part that became the most famous, or maybe infamous, the emigration plan. The idea was to literally take these kids completely out of the city, which he saw as corrupting, and send them west to live on farms, which was seen as this pure, wholesome, virtuous American life. And if you really want to understand why this plan was so attractive to these kids, you just have to listen to them. Listen to this one newsboy, his name was Patty. He's explaining why he ran away from home. "My dad was a harden. He dipped me over the head with an iron pot." And he says it with this kind of tough guy attitude, but the reality behind it is just horrific. For a kid like Patty, leaving wasn't a choice, it was survival. The street was actually safer than his own house.
And get this, here's that same kid, Patty, now basically acting as a recruiter for Braze's plan. He gets up on a stool and gives this incredible speech to all his fellow bummers. He asks them, do you want to be loafers your whole life, or do you want to be gentlemen? He promises them that out west, that's where you become a congressman, even a president. It's the American dream, literally packaged and sold by a 12-year-old boy to his desperate friends. It is one of the most masterful and heartbreaking sales pitches you'll ever hear. In Brace, he knew how to sell this plan. He argued that it worked miracles. What's so powerful about this is the contrast he presents. It was like the ultimate marketing tool for his society. On the one side, you have the before picture, a boy so cut off from the world he's never even heard the name Jesus Christ. And on the other side, the after picture, the absolute peak of success, a letter from one of these former street kids who is now a student at Yale College.
And this is a quote from that young man at Yale. "To be taken from the gutters of New York City and placed in a college is almost a miracle." For Brace and everyone who supported him, this was it. This was the ultimate proof that the plan worked. It showed that these kids weren't born dangerous or bad. They were just products of their environment. And if you can just change that environment, you could save the child.
But, like any huge social experiment, the real story, the legacy, is always way more complicated than just a few happy endings. For every one boy who went to Yale, there are thousands of other stories. And a lot of them, we'll never know. And this is where the picture starts to get a lot more unsettling.
Between 1854 and 1929, these orphan trains, as they came to be called, carried over 200,000 children from cities in the east out to the west. Think about that number. This wasn't a small charity. This was one of the largest mass migrations of children in American history. An entire generation of kids was basically uprooted and scattered across the country, all sent to live with complete strangers in the hope of finding a better life.
Look, there's no doubt that Charles Loring Brace saved thousands of children from lives of unbelievable poverty and, very likely, crime. But the program also often completely cut off all ties to their past. Brothers and sisters were separated, sometimes forever. Kids had their names changed. Their entire family histories, no matter how painful, were just erased. And that leaves us with this really profound and frankly uncomfortable question to think about. Was this a rescue mission? Or was it a kind of removal, driven by a deep-seated fear of the dangerous classes?